Jujutsu Kaisen and Blue Lock are two of my favorite ongoing manga, and surprisingly, I find that these series have very many similarities in both fan base and appeal, despite the obvious gulf in subject matter and genre. This has led me to compare these two manga in the past and comment on what I think it is that they do similarly, namely their thematic stance on individuality and its importance for a person's growth and development. Today, rather than look at what these two manga do similarly though, I'll be looking at Yuji Itadori and Isagi Yoichi, the protagonists of Jujutsu Kaisen and Blue Lock respectively, and using them as tools to analyze and critique the other, breaking down both main characters' strengths and weaknesses within their role in the spotlight. Now, as I've said, Blue Lock and JJK have very many similarities, but how they depict their protagonist is not one of them. Whereas Yuji is the kind of character to consistently have his gratification delayed and delayed despite his attempts at growth, Isagi very much seems to be constantly rewarded throughout his journey with Blue Lock, only occasionally receiving major setbacks that shake him to his core. At a first glance, you would be led to believe that because of that delayed gratification and slower burning evolution, Yuji has to be the better, more rewarding character than Yoichi, who comparatively doesn't have anything in his story that acts as a roadblock. And while I can understand this perspective and had heard similar things about Isagi even in isolation, what I've found in my numerous rereads and analyses of the aforementioned manga is that Yuji goes through much more passive suffering, while Isagi goes through more active suffering. Now, when I say suffering, especially in Isagi's case, this doesn't have to mean going through tragic events, more so roadblocks, problems, things that require him to overcome and evolve as a person, and specifically for the Blue Lock series, as a striker. I'll explain what I mean when I use those terms specifically in a second, but even before doing so, I think it's important to acknowledge that the act of suffering, or once again, more broadly having roadblocks that exist within your path, doesn't inherently lead to you creating or even reading about a better character. There are plenty of trashy manga that come to mind in which the protagonist in question goes through situations significantly worse than either Isagi or Yuji and come out on the other end of it all a shallow and bland amalgamation of meaningless or incoherent character traits. What's extremely important, and something I'll harp on as we continue comparing these two protagonists, is how these obstructions are dealt with and what exactly it is that we can glean from Yuji and Isagi based on their approach to them. Do they act in a way consistent or logical within the set rules established for their character? And if so, how do these obstacles affect their mindset and actions moving forward? Without interesting or thought-provoking answers to these questions, I often find that the pain or strife a character goes through can be meaningless or not achieve the height of its potential. And Deku during his solo hero run is a great example of that. This arc does a decent job of establishing why it isn't in Deku's best interest to go at it alone pragmatically. However, the lack of characterization or insight on Deku specifically leads me and many other fans of the series to look at this moment for him as rather undercooked. Despite this being an instance of suffering on Izuki's part, even relative to what he usually experiences, because we don't get satisfying answers to some pretty fundamental questions that this part of his journey naturally conjures, I think that this part of the story falls short of its potential. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to call this arc bad or this experience a completely useless one for Izuku. However, I would argue that it isn't quite reaching the full breadth of what Horikoshi could have written for the character. It definitely doesn't fall to the level of something like, say, Jujika no Rokunin or Boy's Abyss, where at times it feels like the author just loves making the main character suffer endlessly with no real end or purpose at all. Things for a character to overcome both in a mental and physical aspect are crucial for development and good storytelling, but I also think it's important, especially for this next segment, to understand that pain scaling isn't exactly the most useful way to denote character quality, especially when I'm comparing a soccer manga to a manga about exercising cursed spirits, death, and meaning. Before making that necessary clarification though, I mentioned two terms: passive and active suffering. Now, these two terms may have some meaning on their own outside the context of this video, but I'm gonna be borrowing and warping them for a bit, simply because it makes the Isagi and Itadori comparison much easier to explain and understand. Passive suffering in this instance simply refers to us knowing about a character's turmoil or negative emotions, but not actively seeing them grapple with these struggles on screen. Gege does this a lot for a large portion of his cast, but Yuji specifically does experience this phenomena more than most as the protagonist. In contrast, active suffering just pertains to a character going through their mental troubles on screen and working through them while we get to see it. This can be through dialogue, internal monologues, or even actions that pretty obviously convey what it is that is bothering the person in question. Neither of these versions of suffering or pain are inherently better than the other. Just like most writing devices used in storytelling, they are simply tools that an author can use in order to achieve a desired outcome. And in this instance, Gege and Kaneshiro both rely on very different tools, and as a result, reach very different places with their characters. Now, the definition of these borrowed concepts may not have cleared everything up for you, so let me give a few examples of what these two things may look like and how they contrast one another. Active suffering in Yuji's case looks like his reaction immediately following Sukuna's massacre in Shibuya. We, as the audience, see his struggle, we see the thoughts racing through his mind, and we see how it affects him and the conclusion he draws at the end of the scene. Passive suffering, also in Yuji's case, looks like the "I'm you" moment between him and Mahito. While we are included in Yuji's closure here, before this we don't get to explicitly see or hear Yuji put the pieces together and reach this point on screen. Mahito tells Yuji that they are the same. Mahito makes Yuji aware of this philosophy, of this mindset, of this understanding, but Yuji going from rejecting this idea to accepting it and becoming one with it isn't something that we're necessarily privy to seeing. The development exists and the pieces necessary to help us put everything together are there, but there is a lack of the filling substance in between. Obviously, this isn't a bad thing necessarily, because the shock and punch of Yuji agreeing with Mahito here is so strong and potent that it allows the audience to feel a level of tension and resolve emanating off of Yuji that can only also be felt by Mahito himself. Just like the curse, we are taken aback by this dedication in Yuji's heart because it was hidden from us in the later stages of his fight with Mahito. An effect like this wouldn't be as powerful and as impactful if we were also coming to the same realization and conclusion as Yuji in real time. As I mentioned before, Gege uses this writing device to consistently create moments of shock and awe in the audience since we aren't taken along for the ride so blatantly. Sometimes this works extremely well, as seen in Yuji's defeat of Mahito, but other times I don't think that this passivity sees the same level of success, and I'll illustrate some of those examples later in the video. With Itadori, I hope I've made it clear where the distinction lies between the passivity and activity of his suffering, which may help shine some light on what exactly I mean when I say Isagi is the inverse. See, the core of Isagi's character relies on adaptation and growth. What he lacks in physicality and innate natural talent in the beginning of the story, he makes up for with his willingness and ability to transform into whatever is necessary for him to succeed and keep moving forward. Funnily enough, much like Maharaga, so long as the wheels keep turning in Isagi's head and the puzzle pieces keep flying, he can only be temporarily incapacitated but never truly defeated. As a result, Kaneshiro finds it important to actively demonstrate where Isagi is at any point in a match and contrast it with where he wants to be by its end. The passivity of his suffering or development mainly comes in the time between games. During the Neo Egoist League, for example, there are multiple small points in the story where Isagi is training off-screen to improve his physical abilities and the basics of football, in which he's been lacking for so long. To put simply, his physical development is fast-tracked so we as the audience can make it back to other characters and their own narrative, or the development of the main plotline and Isagi himself. Outside of instances like these though, I'm not quite sure that Isagi has very many examples of epiphanies that we don't see the entire thought process of. Not showing us, in fact, would be antithetical to the premise of his character. Rather than name any specific moment in the story, all I must do is point to any match that he's participated in and allow you to take your pick of what moment you want to embody the active suffering I described. Whether it be the fine-tuning of his direct shot in between the first and second selection, his stealing of Naruhai's off-ball movement to make his own, or his chemical reaction understanding all throughout the second selection as well. No matter which scene you pick, it's likely you'll find a moment that embodies my point, and that's because, at his core, Isagi is someone who grows, and we are the people who watch. The painstaking mental effort that goes into every step is force-fed into our brains as well, and you can notice it in basically every Blue Lock page that concerns Isagi. So put it nicely, bro's a talker. whether it be out loud or in his head, and I think he's a significantly better character for it. Once again, I have to make it clear that neither Yuji nor Isagi are inherently better characters for embodying one of these types of suffering more than the other, and in most cases, I think it works exclusively to the reader's benefit. In Jujutsu Kaisen, we get the shock of finding something out when the opponent does, and in Blue Lock's case, it feels like all of Isagi's growth is our growth, and in some way, we've seen the hero of Blue Lock change before our very eyes. Jujutsu Kaisen still has that effect with Yuji, and Blue Lock still has surprises with Isagi, but when talking about the crux of their characters, it's definitely quite a stark difference in appeal. That being said, it's not all sunshine and rainbows with these protagonists, and I do think that we can use both of them as comparative tools to highlight the other's shortcomings, because while the usage of passivity or activity isn't inherently good or bad, I do think that it's sometimes utilized in moments that aren't the most appropriate and can lead to some pretty wonky issues or just misfires from a writing standpoint. Starting with Isagi, simply because his issues exist a bit more blatantly, but a common problem that people have with his writing is that he seems overpowered. Now, this is a problem that requires a more in-depth answer than yes or no, but that's a topic for an entirely different video. All that needs to be known now is that Isagi's buildup of momentum can sometimes feel a little overbearing, despite what I'd argue is its earned nature. The feeling arises mainly from a lack of the extended gratification delaying that we see in Jujutsu Kaisen. While Isagi certainly doesn't achieve everything he wants within the scope of one match, two matches, or even three, it's quite easy to say that most matches include small victories for him. He'll get beat out on certain plays or stretches of a game, but it's been a long time since Isagi has experienced a complete and utter shutout of his abilities. In fact, I don't think he's experienced a level of denial that potent since the match played against the World 5. That was a complete and utter removal of his agency due to a lack of skill and ability, and since then he's only experienced victories or incomplete defeats. In the U20 match, while he wasn't able to accomplish his goals for a majority of the arc, in the end he was able to become the game's hero and the face of Blue Lock. The Neo Egoist League has come close to shutting him down a few times, although his assist to Kunigami against Barca gave a glimmer of hope, and his assist to Yukimiya in the Manshine game was another instance of him nearly reaching this pinnacle and just falling short, or rather only being able to show off that level of ego due to Kaiser and his meddling. Now, if you wanted to argue that these two are examples of complete shutdowns since Isagi wasn't able to achieve his true goal, I wouldn't necessarily fight you on that. However, I would argue that even in these moments of defeat, Isagi still has something that he can take, and as a fan of the character, you can still obviously see the breadcrumbs being laid out. Both of these games act as defeats for Isagi, but ones that give him hope for the future. Now, personally, I love this for Isagi, as I think it's basically the perfect mix of rewards and setbacks that keeps fans on their toes about exactly how things are going to play out in any given match, and whether or not Isagi will live up entirely to what he imagines in the beginning of a game. That being said, I do think it would benefit him to at least have one more complete shutout game before his ascent to being the greatest striker in the world, because the fall that it would cause would only lead to him having an even more amazing, powerful, and emotionally resonant rise that could genuinely shake the story up. One other negative effect that you could say Isagi's activity has is that he demands so much screen time, especially as he grows into his own as a striker, that the sidecast we've grown to love so much keeps getting pushed further and further into irrelevancy. Rather than being a story about Blue Lock, the manga could sometimes feel like Isagi and Friends. Now, this is potentially just my bias as an Isagi fan, but this isn't the worst fate in the world to me, and also it's just one that I think is pretty overblown. Exaggeration or lack thereof aside though, I do think it's fair to say that Yuji embodies and highlights the two areas of weakness that could be argued to exist within Isagi's character writing. The extended suffering that makes Yuji still feel like an underdog, and the allowance of other side characters to shine, sometimes even more so than himself, definitely are things that Yuji Itadori can teach Yuichi a thing or two about. Focusing on the suffering first, I mean, with Yuji, it's easier to count his complete victories than it is to note all of the instances in which Yuji fails to accomplish his goals. Time after time after time after time, Yuji loses, is defeated, or has victory stolen from him just as it's within his grasp. And while it's uniquely frustrating in a way I'll illustrate soon, sometimes not to the most positive effect, the eventual rise of Itadori will only hit that much harder because of the suffering we went through to get here. And as someone who's kind of on the other side of that awakening, I will say say, I was right. There is a catharsis expected from Yuji that can't be contained, that's still next to an existing fear and a wariness of Gege and how he might yet again pull the rug from under us. In that aspect alone, I do think that Gege and Yuji alike achieve something that Isagi currently is only partially done. But Yuji isn't exempt from criticism either. Sure, the catharsis that'll be felt when Yuji truly defeats Sukuna, saves Megumi, and gets everything that he wanted at the end might not be rivaled by a lot of things I've seen in manga, but that's only the case when we see it. Up until that point in the story, I can understand people's reservations with the repetition of his suffering and agony. At some points, it feels truly earned and appropriate for the moment, but in others, it can feel like Gege just wants to rub it in Yuji's face that he isn't capable of saving everyone he wants to save, and as a result, he's rubbing that in the audience's face as well. Just like the potential problems with Isagi though, I don't really mind this approach all that much. I'm a Megumi fan. I'm also someone who expects a lot from Miwa and was on the Kusakabe train since the end of Shibuya. If nothing else, I'm patient. I'm willing to wait and wait and wait and wait. But just because something doesn't bother me personally doesn't mean it's a great decision in the overarching context of the story. I do think small wins for Yuji on a more regular basis would be an improvement of the situation at hand, not just with a recruitment of stronger allies, but seeing Yuji's proficiency as a sorcerer noticeably increase in a trackable way before our eyes. It doesn't have to be anything grand or special, just background nuggets of information that we could see that we genuinely are able to register that he is growing in a way that makes his awakenings jarring, but not necessarily unearned in their nature. Isagi does this well, as I've already made note of, and that's because he incrementally gets stronger and stronger. He takes in a bit of information here, an odd thing he notices there, some inspiration over here, and slowly starts combining these pieces of data in his mind until, boom, an adaptation concoction is created and he starts taking over the field. That's why the Manshine game is so special to so many Blue Lock fans. Isagi's awakening was just a buildup of prior moments, prior awakenings, prior instances of his ego flaring to lead to the reveal of Metavision. And that's why when he took over, it was such a powerful feeling. It's not pertinent that Yuji does this to the exact same degree, but having Itadori note other sorcerer's strengths and weaknesses or aspects of Jujutsu that he can improve on, even if only in quieter moments, would do a lot for the general audience's patience and belief in what Yuji can do. The explosive moments of change are great, and I don't think those should be replaced or removed. Yuji pulling up on Sukuna in chapter 214 and 215, absolutely fantastic. No notes. But it wouldn't hurt to have a few crumbs sprinkled in the Culling games for Yuji before that, or a longer arc of training showing exactly how Yuji's gotten to where he is now after that, specifically during the month time skip. And just as was the case before, the other protagonist is exemplary of what I'm getting at. Isagi still has explosive moments of spontaneity, like his ambidextrous two-shot volley for instance, but the existence of these moments doesn't necessitate that the methodical or more detailed ones have to be wiped completely off the board. This jarring problem is also somewhat highlighted by Gege's more sparse usage of Yuji relative to Isagi in Blue Lock. Let me nip something in the bud real quick though. Yuji is blatantly the main character in Jujutsu Kaisen. Gege says so, the manga says so, the themes say so, and he still, by far, has the most screen time in the entire story. I also happen to appreciate Gege's economical usage of Yuji because it does allow for the plot to unfold without seeming reliant on Itadori's specific actions. Jujutsu Kaisen is unambiguously a story with Yuji in it, not one where Yuji is the story. It isn't a knock on Isagi or any character that solely moves the plot forward, but in a world as harsh and cruel as Jujutsu Kaisen's, it's more thematically appropriate to make Itadori feel a bit smaller, to make him feel less important than he actually is at times. This stylistic choice will be hit or miss for a lot of people, and personally, it can be hit or miss for me at times, but that's primarily because I would like to see more active characterization and on-screen development of his abilities than most. I don't desire more screen time to affirm his role as the protagonist. I want to see more of him to get a better grasp at who Yuji is and how someone like him improves. In this way, Isagi is a character that has a better handle on his role as protagonist because there's no way you've actually read Blue Lock and want more details on Isagi's state of mind or thought process. A majority of his dialogue might just be him talking to himself, and with Yuji, it almost feels like the opposite to a slightly extreme degree. As is the nature of writing, the stark contrast between the two stories and protagonists breeds a desire and greed for what something else can add, and while that would be nice, I hope that throughout this video I've made it clear that these two function as very, very good main characters. Despite my pieces of advice and criticisms for Yuji and Isagi alike, it is obvious that they lean so heavily into certain aspects of character writing because they are meant to embody concepts and belief systems above all else. Yuji's indomitable will in the face of hopelessness is crucial to his character, so showing us just how hopeless and devoid of chance things really are is important to supporting this theme. And Isagi's adaptive mindset that relies on evolving as the situation does is inherent to who he is in this story. Not showing us that as often, as is the case in Blue Lock, would simply be doing a disservice to his character and the journey of the entire manga. Sure, there are plenty of things that could be slightly improved on the other end in my mind, but both authors hit the mark on these characters so much more consistently than they miss, and when compared to most manga, that's an absolute win. Now, if you want to know my favorite, it's the guy from Blue Lock. But if you made it this far in the video, comment which series has your favorite protagonist of the two, and check out this video where I go over the themes of Jujutsu Kaisen and Blue Lock, and why I think they're so similar. Check out my other Blue Lock and JJK content, and subscribe for more like it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.